A billionaire, a homeless mother, and a fateful night that changes everything. When Henry Smith, a cold and calculating CEO, nearly crashes into a desperate woman on a stormy night, he makes a split-second decision that will unravel secrets, test loyalties, and challenge everything he thought he knew. Who is Emma Wilson? What is she hiding? And why does her presence slowly begin to shatter the walls Henry spent years building? Love, betrayal, redemption. Nothing is as it seems. Subscribe now and don't miss the twists, heartbreak, and ultimate fate of two lost souls colliding in a world where trust is a luxury. Watch the full story only on our channel. The rain poured down mercilessly over New York City, drenching the streets in shimmering reflections of neon lights and headlights. The sidewalks were crowded with people clutching umbrellas, hurrying to escape the cold. Cars rushed through the glistening roads, their tires splashing water onto the pavement as they sped past. It was just another restless night in the city, where everyone seemed too busy to notice anyone else. Emma Wilson tightened her grip on the small, trembling hand of her son Williams. His tiny fingers felt like ice, and she could feel the way his little body shivered through the thin, damp fabric of his jacket. They had been searching for a dry place to rest, but every doorway was occupied, every shelter too full. The cold seeped into her bones, but she forced herself to stay strong. She had to, for Williams. Just as she turned onto a quieter street, a sudden movement caught her eye. A small dog, barely more than a blur of wet fur, dashed out into the road, its paws slipping against the slick asphalt. Its frantic yelps were almost drowned out by the sound of tires splashing through puddles. Emma didn't think. Her body moved before her mind had time to stop her. Letting go of Williams's hand, she darted forward, her boots skidding slightly as she stepped off the curb. The little dog was frozen in the middle of the street, ears flattened against its head, wide eyes reflecting the approaching headlights. A car was coming. Fast. A blast of a car horn split the night. The roar of the engine echoed against the tall buildings. Emma lunged. Her hands closed around the shivering, wet body of the dog, just as the headlights flooded over her. For a split second, time seemed to stretch endlessly. The screech of brakes, the sharp intake of breath, the fear surging through her veins. The car stopped mere inches away. The force of the sudden halt sent water spraying up into her jeans, but she barely noticed. Heart hammering against her ribs, she looked up, blinking against the rain, as the car door flew open. A man stepped out. His expensive shoes hit the wet pavement with purpose, and his tailored coat billowed slightly in the wind. His sharp, stormy blue eyes locked onto her. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded. His voice was deep, authoritative, laced with both anger and concern. Emma clutched the trembling dog against her chest, ignoring the cold seep of water through her sleeves. She lifted her chin slightly, still breathless from the adrenaline. "I was saving him," she said simply. The man ran a hand through his dark, slightly damp hair, exhaling sharply. His gaze flickered to the little boy standing on the curb, wide-eyed and clutching his soaked hoodie, then back to her. The rain continued to fall, but for a moment there was only silence between them. Henry Smith exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel as he navigated through the slick, rain-soaked streets of New York. It had been another exhausting day. Meetings, negotiations, endless phone calls. All he wanted was to get home, pour himself a drink, and forget about work, at least for a few hours. But then, out of nowhere, she appeared. A figure darted into the road right in front of him. The blaring city lights reflected off the wet pavement, making it difficult to see clearly. But there was no mistaking the sheer recklessness of what had just happened. A woman had thrown herself into the street, right into the path of his car. Instinct took over. He slammed his foot on the brake. The tires screeched against the asphalt, the car skidding slightly before coming to a jarring halt just inches away from the woman crouched on the ground. His pulse pounded in his ears. For a moment, all he could hear was the rain hammering against the windshield. Then, his hands still gripping the wheel, he saw her. She was curled protectively around a small, soaked dog, her body shielding it from the rain and the near collision. Her breath came in ragged gasps, but her arms remained firmly wrapped around the trembling creature. She didn't seem concerned for herself at all, only for the tiny life she had just risked everything to save. Henry let out a sharp breath, his frustration bubbling over. He pushed open the car door and stepped out into the downpour, rain immediately soaking through the expensive fabric of his coat. "What the hell were you thinking?" His voice was edged with anger, his heart still hammering from the sudden stop. "Are you out of your mind? You could have been killed." The woman slowly looked up at him, her dark, rain-matted hair clinging to her face. Her eyes, tired yet resolute, met his with quiet defiance. "I wasn't thinking about myself," she said simply, her voice steady despite the way her body shivered. Henry stared at her, his irritation momentarily faltering. He had expected excuses, maybe even an apology. Instead, he was met with a fierce, unwavering determination. His gaze flickered to the little boy standing just a few feet away, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides, his wide eyes locked onto the woman, his mother. Henry felt an unexpected twinge of something foreign settle in his chest. The woman had just risked her life for a stray dog, in this city, where people stepped over each other without a second thought. That was rare. Still, he wasn't sure whether to be impressed or exasperated. Running a hand through his damp hair, he exhaled sharply, looking back at her. "You could have at least looked before jumping into the road," he muttered, shaking his head. She didn't respond. Instead, she gently cradled the small dog against her chest, shielding it from the cold, her fingers carefully brushing over its wet fur. Henry found himself staring. Who was this woman? Henry let out a slow breath, his irritation beginning to fade as he took in the full picture before him. The woman, Emma, was completely drenched, her clothes clinging to her thin frame as the rain continued to pour. The little boy, who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, stood shivering on the sidewalk, his oversized hoodie soaked through, his lips trembling from the cold. It didn't take a genius to see that they had nowhere to go. Henry wasn't the kind of man who got involved in other people's problems. He had spent years building walls around himself, keeping emotions at arm's length. Charity wasn't something he indulged in, not personally anyway, and yet for some reason he found himself hesitating. He glanced at the small dog still cradled in Emma's arms. Even now, freezing and exhausted, she held it with such care, as if its safety mattered more than her own comfort. Something about that struck him. Without fully understanding why, he sighed and ran a hand through his wet hair before speaking. "Get in the car!" Emma blinked, caught off guard. "What?" Henry exhaled, his patience thinning. "You're freezing. Your son is freezing. And unless you have somewhere else to be, which I doubt, you need to get out of this rain." Emma's grip on Williams tightened instinctively. "We're fine," she said quickly, her voice guarded. Henry arched an eyebrow. "Really? Because your kid looks like he's about 2 minutes away from hypothermia." Williams' small body trembled against his mother's side, his teeth chattering. Emma hesitated, her instinct to refuse battling against the undeniable truth. She had no alternative. She had spent too many nights sheltering under bus stops, in doorways, or wherever she could find some semblance of protection. She was used to surviving on her own, but tonight, Williams was too cold, too tired. She looked down at him, her heart clenching at the way he was struggling to stay upright. Henry watched the internal war play out on her face. He could tell she didn't trust him. Smart woman. He wouldn't trust a stranger either. Still, before he could talk himself out of it, he added, "I'm not asking for anything in return. Just a warm place for you two to dry off. That's it." Emma's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but when she looked down at Williams, she knew she had no choice. She swallowed hard, then gave a small, reluctant nod. "Okay." Henry didn't say another word. He simply stepped back and gestured toward the car, watching as she carefully lifted Williams into the passenger seat before sliding in beside him. As he shut the door behind them and walked around to the driver's side, he wondered what the hell he had just gotten himself into. The car ride was mostly silent, aside from the steady patter of rain against the windows. Emma sat rigidly in the seat, her arms still wrapped around the small, trembling dog. She kept her gaze forward, avoiding eye contact with Henry, while Williams, exhausted and shivering, leaned against her side, his eyelids growing heavier by the second. Henry stole a glance at them in the rearview mirror, the boy's small body curled instinctively against his mother, seeking warmth. Emma, despite her obvious exhaustion, remained alert, tense, as if at any moment she expected to be thrown out. It wasn't long before they pulled up to the gated entrance of his home. The wrought iron gates slid open, revealing the long, paved driveway leading to a grand estate. Even in the dim glow of the exterior lights, the mansion loomed impressively against the night sky, its large windows reflecting the shimmering rain. William stirred as the car came to a stop. His sleepy eyes widened the moment he took in the sight before him. "Whoa!" he whispered in awe. Emma, on the other hand, stiffened. Her fingers unconsciously tightened around Williams's shoulder. Henry stepped out first, shaking off the raindrops clinging to his coat. He opened the door for them, gesturing inside. Emma hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong. She didn't belong here. The pristine driveway, the towering entrance, the sheer grandeur of it all. This was another world entirely, one she had no place in. She had spent years scraping by, barely surviving. Now she was standing in front of a mansion that looked like something out of a dream. But to her it felt more like a cruel reminder of how far she had fallen. Williams, however, was too young to understand the weight of her unease. He tugged on her sleeve, his voice filled with excitement. "Mom, we're staying here?" Emma forced a small smile for his sake. "Just for tonight," she murmured. Henry didn't acknowledge the hesitation on her face. He simply pushed open the heavy front doors, leading them inside. The warmth hit them immediately. The grand foyer was spacious, with polished marble floors and a sweeping staircase leading to the second floor. A chandelier cast a soft golden glow over the space, illuminating the elegant decor. The house smelled of leather, wood, and something faintly like fresh coffee. Williams's mouth fell open. "This place is huge." Emma stayed quiet. She felt too out of place to speak. Henry glanced at her and for a brief moment considered reassuring her, but he wasn't sure what to say. Instead, he simply stated, "You can stay here until you figure something out." His voice was even, almost indifferent, like this was just a passing favor, nothing more. But even as he said it, something about the sight of them standing there, wet, tired, displaced, made his chest tighten. Emma, however, didn't respond. She simply nodded, as if reminding herself that this was temporary. She wouldn't let herself believe otherwise. The next morning, Henry barely had time to think about his unexpected guest before he was pulled back into the whirlwind of his work. His schedule was relentless. Meetings, conference calls, and business negotiations that left little room for distractions. As he adjusted his tie in front of the mirror, he caught a glimpse of his reflection. Calm, composed, as always. It was easier to keep things that way. He wasn't the type to get personally involved in other people's lives. Before heading out, he stopped in the hallway where his longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Thompson, was waiting for instructions. She was a woman in her late 50s, efficient and discreet, someone who had been working for him long enough to know he valued order above all else. "There's a woman and her kids staying here for a while," Henry said, keeping his tone casual, as if discussing something trivial. "Make sure they have what they need." Mrs. Thompson raised an eyebrow ever so slightly, though she didn't question him. She had worked for Henry long enough to know he wasn't the type to bring strangers into his home. This was unusual. "I'll take care of it, sir," she said simply. Henry gave a curt nod and turned to leave. He had done his part. He had given them shelter. That was enough. At least, that's what he told himself. Hours later, as he sat in the back seat of his car, being driven to the airport, he pulled out his phone to check his emails. His inbox was full, as usual, but for some reason, instead of opening them, his fingers hesitated over a different app, the security cameras. It wasn't something he usually bothered with. His estate was well secured, and he trusted the staff to handle things in his absence. But before he could talk himself out of it, he tapped the screen. The live feed loaded instantly, showing the different areas of his house. His eyes flicked over the usual sights: empty hallways, the grand foyer, the quiet expanse of the living room. Then he saw them. Emma and Williams were in the kitchen. Mrs. Thompson was setting down a plate of food in front of Williams, who beamed up at her with a gratitude Henry wasn't used to seeing. The boy looked so genuinely happy just to have a warm meal in front of him, a stark contrast to the entitled guests Henry was accustomed to hosting. Emma, meanwhile, was standing by the sink, rolling up her sleeves. He watched as she quietly took a dish from the counter and began washing it, her movements natural, unassuming. She hadn't been asked to help. No one expected her to. And yet there she was, cleaning up after herself as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Henry's brow furrowed slightly. Most people who ended up in a place like his, people he had extended a rare favor to, would act differently. Either they would be uncomfortable, tiptoeing around the space like they didn't belong, or they would take advantage of his generosity, treating his home like a free luxury hotel. But Emma, she didn't do either of those things. She simply existed in the space, taking up as little as possible, contributing in quiet, unspoken ways. He wasn't sure why, but he kept watching. Williams said something that made Mrs. Thompson laugh, and for the first time, Henry saw Emma's lips curve into the faintest smile. It was small, barely there, but it was real. He turned off the screen abruptly, shoving his phone back into his pocket. This wasn't his concern. He had done what he needed to do. And yet, even as his car sped toward the airport, he couldn't quite push the image of them out of his mind. As the days passed, Henry found himself checking the security cameras more often than he cared to admit. At first, he had told himself it was just to make sure everything was fine in his absence. After all, he had never had guests like this before. But the more he watched, the more he realized something surprising. Emma wasn't like other people who found themselves in desperate situations. She wasn't passive, waiting for someone to take care of her. Nor was she taking advantage of his generosity. Instead, she moved through his home with quiet determination, as if she were a guest who had to earn her place. Through the small screen of his phone, Henry watched as she tidied up the kitchen, wiping down the counters after breakfast, washing dishes even when Mrs. Thompson told her she didn't have to. She swept the floor in the hallway, straightened the cushions on the couch, and even reorganized the bookshelf in the living room when she thought no one was looking. It wasn't just the chores, it was the way she carried herself. She never demanded anything. She never acted entitled. If anything, she seemed determined to do more than was necessary, as if making herself useful would justify her presence in the house. And then there was the way she cared for Williams. One evening, Henry opened the camera feed out of habit. The room was dimly lit, a small bedside lamp casting a soft glow over the space. Williams was curled up under the blankets, his small form barely making a dent in the enormous guest bed. Emma sat beside him, gently stroking his hair, a book open in her lap. "And so the little bird flew higher and higher," she read, her voice low and soothing, until finally it reached the top of the sky, where the clouds turned golden in the setting sun. Williams yawned, his eyes fluttering closed. "That sounds pretty," he mumbled sleepily. Emma smiled faintly, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "It is. Maybe one day you'll see it for yourself." There was a quiet moment before the boy whispered, "Do you think we'll ever have a real home, Mom?" Henry felt something tighten in his chest. Emma didn't respond right away. She simply held her son a little closer, pressing a soft kiss to his hair. "We will," she murmured. "I promise." Henry turned off his phone, staring blankly at the darkened screen. She wasn't just a woman who needed help. She was someone who kept going, even when life had given her every reason to stop. One afternoon, as Henry glanced at his phone between meetings, he instinctively opened the security feed again. By now, he had stopped pretending he was only checking for security reasons. He was simply curious. Curious about what Emma would do when she thought no one was watching. Today, the camera in the kitchen showed Mrs. Thompson limping slightly as she moved about, trying to prepare lunch. The older woman was tough, rarely complaining, but Henry immediately noticed the way she winced as she stepped forward. Emma must have noticed too. Without hesitation, she stepped in, gently taking the tray from Mrs. Thompson's hands. "Let me do that," she said softly. Mrs. Thompson frowned, shaking her head. "You don't have to, dear. You're a guest here." Emma only smiled. "You've done enough. Just sit down for a minute, okay?" The housekeeper hesitated, clearly unused to being cared for, but when she tried to take another step and grimaced, Emma didn't wait for permission. She simply guided her to a chair and turned back to the stove, taking over the task as if it were a second nature. Henry watched as Emma moved with ease, stirring the pot, checking the oven, and plating the food without being asked. She wasn't doing it for approval. She wasn't doing it because she felt indebted. She was doing it because someone needed help, and that was just who she was. A few hours later, another moment caught Henry's attention. One of the younger house staff, a girl named Lena, was carrying a stack of fine porcelain dishes when her foot suddenly slipped on the freshly polished floor. The loud crash of breaking glass echoed through the dining room. Lena gasped, horror spreading across her face as she dropped to her knees, scrambling to collect the shattered pieces. I'm so sorry, she stammered, her hands shaking as she tried to clean up the mess. Emma, who had been passing by with Williams, immediately crouched beside her. "Don't touch it with your hands," she said gently, picking up a few larger shards. "You'll cut yourself." Lena blinked, stunned. Most people in this house, guests, business associates, even Henry himself, would have simply walked past, or worse, scolded her for being careless. But Emma? She wasn't angry. She wasn't annoyed. She was just helping. Lena hesitated before whispering, "Thank you." Emma simply smiled. "Accidents happen." Williams, watching the scene unfold, chimed in with a grin. "Mom always says it's okay as long as no one gets hurt." Henry, watching all of this through his phone, exhaled quietly. She had nothing. No money, no home, no security, and yet she still found ways to give. Not because she had to, because that was simply who she was. At first, Henry told himself it was just a habit. A quick glance at the security cameras between meetings, a momentary check-in on the people temporarily staying in his house. That was all. But the truth was, he found himself reaching for his phone more often than necessary. Every day, between the endless flow of business deals and impersonal handshakes, he found himself watching Emma. Not in a way that felt intrusive, but rather with an inexplicable curiosity. It wasn't just what she did, it was how she did it. The way she instinctively helped others, never expecting anything in return. The way she smiled softly at Williams when she thought no one was looking, as if her entire world was wrapped up in that little boy. The way she carried herself with quiet strength despite having every reason to crumble. Henry had spent years building his empire, surrounding himself with efficiency, success, and control. His home, though grand, had always been cold, just another extension of his carefully structured life. But with Emma there, things were different. The house no longer felt quite so empty. One evening, as he sat alone in a hotel suite after another long day of negotiations, he instinctively opened the camera feed again. The screen flickered to life, showing the dimly lit living room. Emma was sitting on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, reading a book aloud to Williams. The boy was curled up beside her, listening intently, his head resting against her shoulder. The small dog, now cleaner and healthier, was nestled at her feet. The scene was so normal, so ordinary, and yet Henry found himself unable to look away. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, just watching. But what unsettled him wasn't the fact that he was watching. It was the quiet, unfamiliar feeling that crept into his chest as he did. Because for the first time in a long while, Henry Smith, the man who had everything, found himself wondering if perhaps he had been missing something all along. And yet he still hadn't realized exactly what that something was. When Henry finally returned home, stepping through the grand entrance of his estate, he immediately sensed that something was different. It wasn't obvious at first. The house still looked the same, elegant, pristine, every piece of furniture exactly where he had left it. The marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of the chandelier. The air still carried the faint scent of polished wood and expensive cologne. And yet there was a shift, a subtle warmth lingering in the spaces that had always felt too vast, too cold. As he set his briefcase down in the foyer, he noticed something that made him pause. Laughter. Not the hollow, practiced kind he heard at business parties, not the forced chuckles of investors humoring one another, but genuine, light-hearted laughter coming from the other side of the house. His brow furrowed slightly as he followed the sound, his polished shoes making soft echoes against the floor. In the living room, he found them. Williams was sprawled across the carpet, giggling as the small dog playfully jumped onto his lap, licking his face enthusiastically. Emma sat cross-legged nearby, shaking her head with a smile, watching her son with a kind of patience and affection that Henry found oddly captivating. The fire in the large stone fireplace crackled softly, casting a golden hue across the room. A book lay open beside Emma, likely one she had been reading to Williams before the playful chaos had started. A cup of tea, hers presumably, rested on the coffee table, steam still curling from its surface. It was a scene of simple domestic comfort, and it felt utterly foreign to Henry. For years, his house had been just that, a house, a collection of expensive furnishings, fine art, and high ceilings. It had never felt like this, like a home. Something in his chest tightened, but he wasn't sure what to do with it. He wasn't the kind of man who stood in doorways, observing warmth he didn't understand. Clearing his throat, he stepped forward. Emma looked up surprised. For a brief moment, he caught something unreadable in her expression, like she wasn't sure how to place him in this new version of his own home. "You're back," she said simply. Henry nodded, shifting slightly. Yeah, it wasn't much of a greeting, but it was all he could manage. Williams, still grinning, turned his wide eyes toward him. "Mr. Henry, look, Biscuit learned a trick." "Biscuit," Henry repeated, raising an eyebrow. Emma exhaled a quiet laugh. Apparently the dog needed a name. Henry looked at the tiny, scrappy thing bouncing excitedly beside Williams and found himself shaking his head. Biscuit. Ridiculous. But somehow it fit. And just like that, he realized that his home was no longer just his own. The strangest part? He wasn't sure he minded. Henry had barely settled back into the rhythm of being home when the past came knocking. Quite literally. The knock at the front door was sharp, impatient. Before Mrs. Thompson could even reach for the handle, the door swung open, revealing Olivia Harper, poised as always in her designer heels and perfectly tailored coat. "Henry," she greeted smoothly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You didn't tell me you were back." Henry barely suppressed a sigh. He hadn't told her because he hadn't planned on seeing her. Their relationship had ended months ago, if you could even call it a relationship. It had been more of a mutually beneficial arrangement, built on status and convenience rather than anything real. Olivia had enjoyed the prestige of dating him, and he had tolerated the company. But after a while, even that had lost its appeal. He didn't have time for unnecessary distractions. And Olivia? Well, Olivia had always been unnecessary. Still, old habits died hard. She acted as if she still belonged here, like nothing had changed. But something had changed. Olivia barely had time to glance at Henry before her sharp eyes landed on Emma, who had just walked into the room carrying a stack of neatly folded laundry. There was a flicker of surprise on Olivia's face, quickly masked by something sharper. Her gaze swept over Emma, taking in her plain clothes, her simple posture, the quiet way she carried herself. Then her eyes moved to Williams, who was curled up on the couch with a book, oblivious to the sudden tension in the room. Realization dawned, and Olivia did not look pleased. "Oh," she said, her voice laced with amusement and thinly veiled disdain. "I see you've been busy while you were away." Emma stopped mid-step, glancing between them. She could read the situation instantly. This woman wasn't just anyone. She was someone from his world, someone who fit here, unlike her. Henry's expression darkened. "Olivia, this isn't—" But Olivia was already stepping forward, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "And who is this?" she asked, tilting her head toward Emma, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Emma straightened her spine. She wasn't easily intimidated, but she also wasn't foolish. This was Henry's personal life, not hers. So she simply answered, "Emma Wilson." Olivia let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Emma Wilson," she repeated, as if testing the name on her tongue. "And I assume you're staying here?" Emma didn't respond. She wasn't about to explain herself to this woman. Henry's jaw tensed. It's none of your business. That was the wrong thing to say. Olivia's eyes flashed and her lips parted in mock understanding. Ah, so that's what this is. She turned to Henry, voice dropping into something more condescending. I have to say, I didn't expect this from you. A woman you barely know? With a kid, no less? Are you sure this is generosity and not just some misplaced hero complex? Emma's hands clenched around the laundry in her arms, but she stayed silent. Henry, however, didn't look amused. His expression hardened, his posture stiffening as he took a step closer. You should leave. But Olivia wasn't done. She folded her arms, a knowing smirk playing on her lips. Henry, come on. You're smarter than this. You really believe she isn't using you? Silence. And in that silence, something shifted. Henry didn't defend Emma. He didn't immediately shut Olivia down. Because the truth was, somewhere, buried deep in his mind, the question had already been there. He had seen Emma's kindness. He had watched the way she cared for others, never once asking for anything in return. But he had also seen desperation before. He had seen people take advantage of those who had more, wrapping their actions in innocence. And for the first time since she had arrived, a small seed of doubt planted itself in his mind. Olivia noticed, and she smiled. That's what I thought, she murmured, stepping past him. Just be careful, Henry. You're not the kind of man who makes sentimental mistakes. Don't start now. Then without another word, she turned and walked out the door, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. Henry didn't look at Emma. And Emma? She didn't say a word, but the way her expression shuddered, the way her shoulders stiffened ever so slightly, she didn't have to. For the first time since bringing Emma and Williams into his home, Henry felt uncertain. He had seen Emma's kindness firsthand. He had watched the way she cared for her son, the way she never took more than she needed, the way she helped without being asked. She had never once asked him for money, for favors, for anything. And yet, Olivia's words lingered. Are you sure she isn't using you? It was a ridiculous thought, wasn't it? Henry had spent years navigating a world where people only ever wanted something from him, business partners, investors, even past relationships. He had learned to expect it. It had never bothered him before because he knew how to handle it. But this was different. Emma wasn't asking for anything. And maybe that was the problem. Because if she wasn't asking, if she wasn't trying to take advantage, then why did it feel like he was the one being pulled into something beyond his control? So Henry did what he had always done when something felt uncertain. He stepped back. It was subtle at first, a shift in his tone, a hesitation in his interactions with her. The casual moments where he might have asked about Williams's day or commented on something Emma was reading simply stopped. His words became more clipped, his demeanor more distant. He convinced himself that he was simply regaining control. Emma noticed immediately. She wasn't the type to beg for attention, nor was she the kind of person to expect warmth from others. Life had taught her otherwise. But Henry's change was impossible to ignore. He no longer lingered in the living room when Williams was playing. He no longer looked at her the same way, as if he was trying to figure her out, as if he wanted to. And the worst part? His silence. Before, even if Henry had been reserved, his presence had felt solid, certain. Now it felt like she was living in a stranger's house all over again. One evening after Williams had gone to bed, Emma passed Henry in the hallway. Normally, he would at least acknowledge her, a nod, a short comment, something, but this time he barely looked at her. Emma hesitated, her grip tightening on the towel she was carrying. Then, against her better judgment, she spoke. Is something wrong? Henry paused. For a second, then without looking at her, he simply said, no, and kept walking. It was the first time since she had met him that Emma felt something close to regret for ever stepping into his car that night. Emma sat at the edge of the guest room bed, staring at the small bag in front of her. It wasn't much, just a few clothes, some secondhand items Mrs. Thompson had given her for Williams, and the essentials they had gathered since coming here. It was nothing compared to the grandness of the house around her. And yet it was everything she had. She had made up her mind. She wasn't going to stay in a place where she was merely tolerated. At first, she had allowed herself to believe, if only for a fleeting moment, that this house had become something more than just a roof over her head, that she and Williams had carved out a small space here, one that felt warm, safe, even if it wasn't theirs to keep. But Henry's distance these past few days had been impossible to ignore. His avoidance, his hesitation, the way he no longer looked at her the same way. She didn't know exactly what had changed, but she knew enough. Henry regretted helping her. Maybe he thought she was taking advantage of his kindness. Maybe he had finally realized she didn't belong in his world. Whatever it was, she refused to stay where she wasn't wanted. She exhaled slowly, then turned to Williams, who was sitting cross-legged on the bed, holding Biscuit in his lap. "Come on, sweetheart," she said gently. "We're leaving." Williams's head snapped up. "Leaving?" Emma forced a smile, trying to sound reassuring. "It's time for us to go." The little boy frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "But why? Mr. Henry said we could stay." Emma swallowed. "That was before. Things have changed." Williams clutched Biscuit closer to his chest. But I like it here." His voice was small, trembling. "It feels like a real home." Emma's heart clenched. She had tried so hard to protect him from this, to keep him from growing too attached. But she had failed. She reached forward, smoothing his messy curls. "I know, baby, but we can't stay where we don't belong." Tears welled up in his wide, innocent eyes. "I don't want to go." Emma felt her own throat tighten, but she pushed past it. She had to be strong. Taking his hand, she pulled him off the bed and led him toward the door. They moved through the quiet halls, their footsteps nearly silent against the polished floors. The house felt different now. Too big, too hollow, too cold. At the front entrance, she hesitated for only a moment before opening the door. The night air was sharp and unforgiving, the chill creeping into her skin, reminding her of where they truly belonged. Williams sniffled beside her, wiping at his eyes. "I don't think Mr. Henry wants us to leave," he whispered. Emma tightened her grip on his little hand. "He hasn't asked us to stay either." And with that, she stepped out into the night, closing the door behind her. Henry had always appreciated silence. For years, his house had been a place of order and control. Empty halls, quiet rooms, no disruptions. He had never found it unsettling before. But tonight, as he stepped into the foyer and found it too quiet, something felt off. There were no faint sounds of Williams's giggles echoing from the living room. No soft murmurs of Emma reading to him before bed. No warmth from the kitchen where Mrs. Thompson had grown accustomed to making extra servings for an additional 2 guests. Just silence, a heavy, suffocating kind of silence. His gaze drifted to the staircase where he had last seen Emma and Williams only a few hours ago. The feeling in his chest, the one he refused to acknowledge, grew heavier. He wasn't sure what had made him look, but he turned toward the guest room, stepping toward the one they had stayed in. The door was slightly ajar. Henry hesitated. Then, pushing it open, he was greeted by an almost eerie emptiness. The bed had been neatly made. The small belongings that had begun to occupy the space, the books Emma had borrowed, the few toys Williams had played with, were gone. It was as if they had never been there at all. His jaw tightened. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. They left. He didn't know why it surprised him. Hadn't this been inevitable? Hadn't he in some way pushed them away? He swallowed, forcing himself to step back, to close the door behind him. It didn't matter. They had never belonged here, right? But as he walked through his now empty home, the absence of them felt like a wound he couldn't quite place. He had always thought loneliness was something he had chosen. Now, for the first time, he wasn't so sure. Henry sat at his desk, fingers drumming against the polished wood as he stared at the empty screen of his laptop. The house was quiet, too quiet. He had spent the last few days telling himself that their absence didn't matter, that life would simply go back to how it was before. And yet it hadn't. Every time he walked past the living room, he expected to hear Williams laughing. Every time he entered the dining room, he expected to see Emma quietly helping Mrs. Thompson. Every time he sat in his office, he expected to glance at his phone and check the cameras, only to remember that there was nothing left to see. The silence was gnawing at him. Finally, unable to ignore the unease coiling in his chest, he picked up his phone. "Find out everything you can about Emma Wilson," he said into the receiver. The investigator on the other end barely hesitated. Henry Smith wasn't the kind of man who made personal requests, so when he did, people listened. Less than 24 hours later, a file landed on his desk. Henry unfolded it, his sharp eyes scanning through the pages. And what he found made something in him shift. Emma Wilson hadn't always been homeless. She had once lived a comfortable, stable life. Not wealthy, but steady. A good job, a modest home, and a future that had seemed secure. Until it all collapsed. The betrayal had started with someone she trusted, her fiancé, a man who had promised to take care of her and Williams, who had convinced her to put everything in his name, only to turn around and take everything. Her home? Gone. Her savings? Drained. Her security? Shattered. She had been left with nothing but her son and the clothes on her back, and yet she had never stopped fighting. There were no reports of her stealing, no records of her taking advantage of anyone, no history of begging or relying on handouts. Instead, there were notes about the odd jobs she had taken, the shelters she had stayed in, the ways she had struggled to keep Williams safe without ever compromising her dignity. Henry exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. She had never been using him. She had never once asked for his help. If anything, she had done everything she could to leave before she overstayed her welcome. He closed the file, rubbing a hand over his face. He had made a mistake, and for the first time in a long time, Henry Smith wasn't sure how to fix it. The moment Henry closed the file, a heavy weight settled in his chest. He had spent his entire life making calculated decisions, analyzing risks, predicting outcomes, and yet he had completely misjudged her. Emma hadn't stayed because she wanted something from him. She had stayed because she had nowhere else to go, and she had left because she had too much pride to be seen as a burden. Now she was out there, on the streets, in the cold, with nowhere safe to sleep. Henry didn't hesitate. He grabbed his car keys and strode out of the house, his movements sharp, determined. Mrs. Thompson called after him, startled by his urgency, but he didn't stop. He didn't have time to explain. He had to find them. The rain had started again, light but steady. It blurred the city lights, turning the streets into a hazy, dimly lit maze. Henry's grip tightened around the steering wheel as he drove, scanning the sidewalks, the alleyways, anywhere someone might seek shelter. He had never realized just how many people were out here, lost in the margins of a city that never slowed down for anyone. The thought made his chest tighten. How many nights had Emma spent like this? How many times had she clutched Williams close, trying to keep him warm while the rest of the world passed her by? He should have stopped her. He should have said something. And now all he could do was pray he wasn't too late. It was past midnight when he finally saw them. Emma and Williams were curled up under the awning of an abandoned storefront, its windows covered in graffiti, the doorway barely offering enough protection from the cold wind. Emma's arms were wrapped tightly around Williams, shielding him as best she could. The little boy was asleep, his head tucked against her chest, but even in sleep, his small frame shivered. Beside them, Biscuit was curled into a ball, pressed against Emma's side as if trying to offer warmth. And Emma, she was awake, barely. Her eyes were heavy, dark circles shadowing her pale face, her body stiff from exhaustion. But she wasn't sleeping. She couldn't afford to. Henry's heart clenched at the sight. She had been here like this for days, and he had been in his warm, comfortable home, telling himself it wasn't his problem. He had done this. The guilt hit him like a punch to the gut. For the first time in his life, Henry Smith, the man who never second-guessed himself, felt ashamed. Without thinking, he pushed open the car door and stepped into the rain. Emma's head jerked up at the sound. Her tired, wary eyes met his. She blinked, as if she wasn't sure if he was real or if she was too exhausted to trust her own vision. Henry didn't speak right away, Because what could he possibly say that would make this right? Instead, he did the only thing he could. He held out his hand. "Come home," he said, his voice rough, thick with something he couldn't name. Emma stared at him. She didn't move. She looked at his hand, then back at him, her expression unreadable. Then after a long, painful moment, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" Henry exhaled, his jaw tightening. "Because I was wrong. Because I let you walk away when I should have stopped you. Because I can't stand the thought of you and Williams out here another night. Because I don't want my house to be empty again." Instead, he simply said, "Because you don't belong here." For a moment, it seemed like she was going to argue, that she was going to shake her head, insist that she and Williams would figure things out on their own. But then, Williams stirred in her arms, shifting against her, letting out a small, tired whimper. And Emma's resolve broke. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against his. And for the first time since she had left, Henry finally breathed. Henry took a slow, measured step closer, careful not to startle her. The rain dripped from his coat, soaking into the cracked pavement beneath his feet, but he barely noticed. His entire focus was on her, the woman sitting in the cold, her arms wrapped around her son, her expression caught between exhaustion and wariness. He had seen Emma strong, he had seen her resilient, but now she just looked tired, and he had done that to her. His voice was quieter this time, softer than it had been in years. "I was wrong." Emma's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. She just watched him, as if waiting for an explanation. Henry swallowed, the words feeling foreign on his tongue, but he forced himself to say them anyway. "I doubted you when I shouldn't have. I listened to the wrong people, instead of trusting what I saw with my own eyes. I pushed you away when I should have asked you to stay." Emma's grip on Williams tightened slightly, as if shielding herself from the weight of his words. "I'm not asking for anything," he continued. I just want you to come back." Emma's breath hitched, and for a moment she hesitated, because she had heard promises before, she had trusted before, and every time it had led to disappointment, to loss, to another night spent in the cold. But then, a small figure wriggled out of her grasp. Before Emma could stop him, Williams broke free and ran toward Henry, his little arms wrapping around the man's waist with all the force his small body could muster. "Mr. Henry!" Williams's voice cracked with relief, his face buried in Henry's coat. "I knew you'd come!" Henry stiffened for half a second, because when was the last time someone had held him like this? Trusted him like this? But then his arms moved without thinking, instinctively pulling Williams closer, his large hand cradling the back of the boy's head. And that's when Emma realized. Henry meant it. This wasn't obligation. This wasn't guilt. This was real. She swallowed, her throat tight as she looked at her son. The boy who had spent his entire life knowing nothing but instability, who had found something safe, something steady, in a man she had never expected to trust. And in that moment, Emma understood. She wanted to believe him. Maybe, just maybe this time she could. Slowly she stood up. Henry met her eyes, still holding Williams close, but he made no move to pressure her. He was giving her the choice. For once, someone was giving her the choice. Emma exhaled shakily, then nodded. "Okay," she whispered. A flicker of relief crossed Henry's face, so quick she almost missed it. Then without another word, he led them home. When they arrived back at the estate, it didn't feel the same as the night Emma had first stepped through those doors. Back then, she had felt like an intruder, someone who didn't belong in a house so grand, so polished, so far removed from the world she knew. But this time the air felt different. Henry didn't just drop them off and walk away. He led them inside, moving with purpose, making sure Williams was warm and settled before turning to Emma. "Your room is still yours," he said simply, as if she had never left. Emma hesitated. "Henry, You're not just staying here." His voice was firm, but not unkind. "You're not just passing through." Emma blinked at him, caught off guard. "Then what am I doing?" Henry exhaled, running a hand through his hair before meeting her gaze. You're starting over. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a favor. It was a decision. Emma stared at him, unsure of what to say. No one had ever given her that before. A chance, a real, honest chance to rebuild. Not as someone's burden, not as someone waiting for help to run out, but as a person who deserves stability, security, a life. Henry could see the uncertainty flickering in her eyes, so he continued. You need a job, something stable. His tone was matter-of-fact. You can work at my company, if you want to, or somewhere else. I don't care which, but you're not going back to barely surviving. Emma swallowed. Henry, I appreciate what you're doing, but this isn't charity, he cut in, as if sensing her reluctance. I'm not giving you anything. I'm just making sure you have what you need to do it yourself. Emma searched his face, trying to find some trace of pity, some lingering doubt that she was just another person he felt responsible for. But there was none. There was only conviction. Slowly, her fingers curled at her sides. You really think I can start over? She asked quietly. Henry didn't hesitate. I know you can. And for the first time in a long time, Emma felt like maybe, just maybe, she believed it too. It didn't take long for Olivia to notice the shift. Henry had always been distant, emotionally reserved, a man who valued control above all else. That was what had made him so appealing to her in the first place. He was predictable, logical, unaffected by things as trivial as emotions. But now he was different. It started with the little things. She had called him 3 times in the past week, expecting him to answer. He never did. She had dropped by his office, assuming he'd at least entertain a conversation. He barely looked up from his desk, and when she finally cornered him at a charity event, her patience snapping, she realized why. Emma was there. Not as a guest, not as a temporary fixture, but as someone who belonged. Henry stood beside her, listening as she spoke to one of his business partners, his usual guarded expression notably softer. There was a quiet attentiveness in his posture, something Olivia had never seen from him before. The worst part? He didn't even notice Olivia standing across the room. When he finally did, it wasn't with the familiarity she had been expecting. It was with indifference, as if she were just another face in the crowd. It stung, so when she finally approached him, she didn't bother with pleasantries. You've changed, she said, her voice smooth but laced with something sharper. Henry barely blinked. I suppose I have. Olivia let out a quiet, humorless laugh. And let me guess, it's because of her. Henry didn't respond right away. He could have argued, he could have deflected, but he didn't. Instead, he simply said, it's because I finally know what matters. Olivia felt the words like a slap, because for the first time she understood. Henry Smith, the man she had always assumed would come back to her, the man who never let emotions dictate his choices, was gone. He had made his choice, and she wasn't a part of it. With a forced smile and a hollow laugh, Olivia swirled the champagne in her glass and stepped away. She didn't say goodbye, because there was nothing left to say. Emma sat across from Henry in his office, staring at the document in front of her. She had never imagined herself sitting in a place like this, a sleek, glass-paneled office high above the city, where decisions worth millions were made with the stroke of a pen. And yet, here she was, her fingers hesitating over the contract he had placed before her. You want me to work for you? She said, still trying to process it. Henry leaned back in his chair, watching her with his usual unreadable expression. I want you to have a choice. Emma exhaled, shaking her head. Henry, I don't have experience in... You're smart. You're resourceful. You ran a household on nothing, took care of Williams, and somehow still found ways to help the people around you, he said plainly. You'll learn. Emma bit her lip. It wasn't that simple. This wasn't just some favor. This was a job, a career, a chance to rebuild everything she had lost. She had spent so long surviving. Now, for the first time, she had the opportunity to live. Her fingers tightened around the pen, her heart pounding. Okay, she whispered, and then more firmly, I'll do it. A flicker of something? Satisfaction? Relief crossed Henry's face. Good. Williams was thrilled when Emma told him he would be starting at a new school. Do they have books? He asked excitedly. Emma laughed, ruffling his hair. A whole library, Williams gasped. Like a real library? Yes, a real one. William's eyes lit up, and for a moment, Emma forgot all the doubts that had lingered in her mind. This was what she had wanted for him, for both of them. A real home, a real future. And this time, she wasn't doing it alone. Henry had given her the tools, but she had built the foundation herself. She wasn't just a woman who had been taken in. She was Emma Wilson, capable, strong, and finally standing on her own 2 feet. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and somehow, without either of them realizing it, Henry and Emma had become something more than just two people sharing a space. It wasn't sudden. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic moment where everything changed in an instant. It happened in the small things. It was the way Emma always left a cup of coffee on Henry's desk in the mornings, knowing he often forgot to make one himself. It was the way Henry started coming home earlier, not because he had to, but because he wanted to be there when Williams finished his homework, when Emma was making dinner, when the house felt full. It was the way Williams fell asleep curled up against Henry's side on the couch, as if he had always belonged there. The change wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, natural, as if this had always been where they were meant to be. One evening, as Emma stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the vast garden, she felt a presence beside her. Henry. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. She had grown used to his quiet way of entering a room, to the warmth of his presence near her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Henry exhaled softly and said the words that had been lingering between them for far too long. Stay, not because you need to, not because I feel responsible for you. Stay because I want you to. Emma turned to look at him. His gaze was steady, unwavering, the way it always was when he made a decision. And yet this was different. This wasn't a business deal, wasn't an offer of help or obligation. This was a choice. Emma swallowed, her heart pounding. Henry. His voice was quiet but certain. You and Williams belong here. A lump formed in her throat. She had spent so long being unwanted, being temporary, being a burden. She had spent years building walls around her heart, never expecting to find something like this. But Henry had become home. And for the first time, she let herself believe she could have this. Emma nodded. Okay, Henry exhaled, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something close to relief in his expression. Williams, who had been listening from the hallway, ran into the room and threw himself at both of them, his arms wrapping around them in a fierce hug. Does this mean we're a real family now? He asked, looking up at Henry with hopeful eyes. Henry crouched down, ruffling the boy's hair with a rare, genuine smile. Yeah, kid, it does. And for the first time in his life, Henry Smith, the man who had spent years believing he was better off alone, realized that family had found him when he least expected it. That night, for the first time, the house was no longer just a house. It was a home.